Some ideas are dangerous because they provoke. Others are dangerous because they reveal. Atheism does something that religion has never quite known how to deal with. It doesn't challenge a God's name. It doesn't argue over which scripture is more divine. It doesn't ask for a different heaven or a revised path to salvation. It simply says, what if the entire premise is wrong? And that's exactly why atheism tends to unsettle religious belief more deeply than other belief systems ever could. Not because it's hostile, but because it quietly threatens the structure from the ground up. When religions debate each other, they stay on familiar terrain. God is still sacred, faith is still a virtue, the metaphysical still matters more than the physical. Even when they disagree, they agree that belief is the default setting. But atheism doesn't play by those rules. It declines the invitation entirely. And when someone walks away from a game you think is life or death, that's not just disagreement, it's disobedience. It's perceived as something more destabilizing than heresy. Indifference. The first reason religion fears atheism more than other religions is simple. Other religions are rivals. Atheism is a rejection. It doesn't come with replacement myths, it doesn't offer new rituals, it doesn't dress up its worldview in robes or incense. It asks questions that can't be answered with parables. Why does an all-powerful God need to be worshipped? Why does morality require a divine stamp? Why do ancient books written by men who knew nothing of atoms or galaxies or germ theory still dictate our most personal decisions? These aren't hostile questions, they're just uncomfortable ones. Because they don't seek better theology, they question the need for theology at all. Religions are structured, hierarchical, and deeply social. Atheism is often solitary, quiet, personal. And yet, it's that quiet that's so threatening, because when someone no longer fears eternal punishment, they become harder to control. That's not an abstract idea. It's why blasphemy laws still exist in more than 80 countries, and why atheists in some parts of the world are imprisoned or killed just for saying they don't believe. In many societies, it's safer to convert to another religion than to openly say you have none. That's not a coincidence. It's a reflection of how religious institutions perceive risk. A competing religion might steal your followers, but a person who stops believing entirely makes others wonder if they can too. Religious leaders aren't just spiritual guides, they're often social and political figures with real power. A population that stops believing in divine authority tends to stop believing in earthly authority cloaked in divine legitimacy. This is why regimes built around religion are quick to censor atheist ideas, even when they're calmly stated. A single sentence, "I don't believe," is more corrosive than volumes of competing scripture. It's not because atheists are louder, it's because they're speaking a different language altogether, one that doesn't require translation through dogma or centuries of inherited fear. Psychologically, it also hits deeper. Most religious people were raised in belief before they had the ability to question it. The idea of God was introduced not as a theory to consider, but as a fact to live by. The idea that someone could genuinely not believe can feel to them like a threat to the very fabric of meaning. It's not just disagreement, it's existential. Other religions allow people to keep the basic emotional scaffolding: purpose, hope, ritual, community. Atheism asks you to build meaning yourself. That's liberating to some, but terrifying to others, especially to those whose lives have been centered around divine purpose. So when atheism enters the room, it's not just seen as a rival idea, it's seen as an unraveling. Even in secular societies, that unease lingers. Studies show that atheists are still among the least trusted minorities in many Western countries, not because of what they've done, but because of what they don't believe. There's an instinctive suspicion. If you don't believe in a higher power, how can you be moral? The irony is, that question says more about the person asking than the person answering. It assumes that morality can't come from empathy or reason or shared human experience. It assumes we need rules handed down from above, instead of values grown from the ground up. But history complicates that assumption. Some of the worst atrocities have been committed in the name of gods, not despite religion, but because of it. And some of the most ethical, compassionate people have lived and died without ever believing in divine reward. Religion isn't a guarantee of goodness, just as atheism isn't a sign of emptiness. Yet the stereotype persists that belief means morality and disbelief means chaos. That fear isn't new. It's been built into theology for centuries. Atheists have often been painted as dangerous, rebellious, even demonic, not because they caused harm, but because they didn't conform. And nonconformity threatens any system that survives on obedience. When belief is seen as the foundation of civilization, disbelief looks like demolition, even if it's quiet, even if it's kind, even if it's thoughtful and rooted in real questions. That's what makes it so powerful. Other religions compete within the same framework. Atheism walks out of the frame entirely. And while it offers no universal answers, no holy books, no prophets, no creeds, it offers something else: the freedom to say, "I don't know," without fear. That kind of intellectual honesty is rare and unsettling, especially to those whose authority depends on certainty. Certainty is addictive, but it comes with a cost. Religions often promise it: clear rules, cosmic purpose, a guaranteed afterlife. That level of assurance is comforting, especially in a world filled with uncertainty. But comfort isn't the same as truth. Atheism removes that safety net. It doesn't replace it with another belief. It replaces it with responsibility. You're no longer living according to a divine script. You're writing your own story, knowing that no invisible hand is guiding the pen. That's empowering for some. For others, it's deeply uncomfortable, not just personally, but socially. Religious systems rely on shared narratives. They form group identity. They bind people together with a common set of myths, values, and rituals. When someone steps outside that circle, not to join another one, but to question the need for circles at all, it threatens cohesion. You're not just a dissenter, you're a disruption. Sociologists have long observed this pattern. Belief systems tend to protect themselves not just by preaching, but by punishing doubt. And the harsher the system, the more aggressively it targets non-belief. In tight-knit religious communities, you can question the details, pray in a slightly different way, follow a slightly different teacher, and still be tolerated. But stop believing entirely? That's often seen as betrayal. And betrayals need scapegoats. Theists have often served that role, not because they're disruptive in practice, but because they're disruptive in principle. They reveal that belief isn't inevitable, that people can live moral, meaningful, fulfilled lives without subscribing to any supernatural claim. That's a dangerous example, not because it's wrong, but because it's persuasive. Religious institutions often depend on a binary. You either believe or you descend into moral decay. But when someone who doesn't believe still acts with compassion, integrity, and courage, the binary starts to break down. It's not a coincidence that many prominent atheist thinkers, past and present, have been framed as arrogant or nihilistic. Those labels aren't based on their arguments, they're defenses against what those arguments represent. Because if atheists aren't miserable, if they aren't selfish, if they aren't lost or broken, then the entire narrative that belief is necessary for meaning begins to erode. It's far easier to dismiss someone as dangerous than to admit they might be right. And this fear isn't just cultural, it runs deep in the psychology of belief. Studies in cognitive science show that humans are prone to what's called agent detection, the instinct to attribute events to intentional forces. It's what helped our ancestors survive in uncertain environments. But it also means we're wired to see purpose where there might be none. Religion taps into that instinct. It builds entire systems on top of it. And so when atheism suggests that life might not have a grand author, that not every event is part of a divine plan, it doesn't just challenge theology, it challenges the way our brains try to make sense of chaos. That's not a comforting idea, but it can be a liberating one, because it opens the door to questions that religion often closes too quickly. Questions like, what if meaning is something we create, not something we're handed? What if morality is better when it comes from empathy, not commandments? What if our lives matter not because of where they came from, but because of what we do with them? These aren't empty questions, they're foundational, and they're exactly the kind of questions that make religion nervous. Not because they're blasphemous, but because they don't need belief to be valid. This is part of what separates atheism from other religious systems. It doesn't seek converts. It doesn't offer promises. It doesn't depend on sacred texts or charismatic leaders. It simply invites people to think, and to keep thinking, even when the answers don't come wrapped in certainty. That's a radically different model of thought. And in a world where so many are trained to submit to authority, divine or otherwise, independent thought is often treated as a threat. This is why in some communities an atheist child is seen as more dangerous than a child who joins another religion. It's not about doctrine, it's about control. And nothing is harder to control than someone who doesn't believe you're entitled to it in the first place. Even religious reformers, those who push for a gentler, more progressive faith, tend to draw a line at full non-belief. Atheism isn't just one step further, it's stepping outside the map entirely. And that's the real fear. Because when you step outside the map, you stop following paths drawn by someone else. You start asking why the map was drawn that way at all. Who benefits from it? Who doesn't? What's missing? What's hidden? What was never real in the first place? Atheism isn't immune to flaws. Like any worldview, it can fall into arrogance, dogmatism, or tunnel vision. But at its core, it offers something unique: the ability to say no, not just to a specific god or religion, but to the idea that belief itself is the foundation of worth. That's not a rejection of values, it's a recentering of them. In a religious framework, the highest virtue is often obedience. In an atheistic one, it's integrity. That difference runs deep. And it shapes everything from how we treat others to how we understand ourselves. Religions often speak of humility, but they rarely apply it to their own claims. Atheism, when practiced with sincerity, is a kind of intellectual humility, a willingness to say, we don't know, and we're okay with that. That's not a threat to goodness, it's a threat to certainty. And that's why it rattles belief systems more than anything else ever could. There's a reason religions rarely teach their followers how to think critically about belief itself. They'll encourage questions, but only within the boundaries of faith. Ask why a commandment exists, and you'll be offered interpretations. Ask whether the commandment is even valid. And suddenly, the conversation changes. That shift from interpretation to interrogation is where discomfort begins. Atheism lives in that space, not in opposition for its own sake, but in asking what happens when you remove the assumption of divine truth altogether. And that's something even religious pluralism struggles with. Most belief systems can accommodate each other, at least on the surface. They can say we believe different things, but we're all seeking the same truth. It sounds peaceful, inclusive, but it only works as long as everyone agrees that belief is a virtue in itself. Atheism doesn't fit that mold. It doesn't seek a different version of faith, it questions the role of faith entirely. And that makes religious coexistence with atheism far more strained. It's not just about theology, it's about the very idea that belief should be the basis of identity. And if belief isn't necessary, then maybe religion isn't either. That's the kind of realization that can't be unthought once it takes root. And that's exactly why religions throughout history have worked so hard to prevent it from taking root at all. From ancient blasphemy laws to modern political systems where questioning religion is equated with moral decay, the fear of atheism has always run deeper than any theological disagreement. Because atheism doesn't argue for a different heaven, it argues that maybe we're wasting our one life chasing. And that can be a powerful, even devastating realization, especially for those who've built their entire identity around promises of eternity. It's not just fear of death, it's fear that meaning might have to be self-made. And that's hard. It's easier to be told what life means than to figure it out yourself. Religions offer a packaged sense of purpose. Atheism doesn't. It invites you to build one from scratch. That's liberating, but it's work. And not everyone wants that work. Some resent it, some fear what it reveals, especially when it shows how much of religion's comfort is based not on truth, but on familiarity. When someone steps away from belief, not in anger, not out of trauma, but simply because they stopped finding it credible, it undermines the idea that religion is the default human condition. And if belief isn't the default, maybe doubt is? That flips the narrative. And that's why atheism often evokes a stronger reaction than alternative beliefs. Not because it's aggressive, but because it reveals how fragile religious certainty really is. When your worldview is built on the idea that disbelief is impossible, that deep down everyone believes, even if they don't admit it, a sincere non-believer is an existential problem. It's why some apologists argue that atheists are just angry at God, that they secretly believe deep down, because the alternative, that someone genuinely doesn't believe at all, is harder to accept. It implies that faith isn't universal, that it's not written into the soul, that it's not inevitable, and that makes it optional. Optional beliefs don't inspire as much loyalty. If you can live morally without a God, then what is the God offering, besides tradition and identity? And once those things are questioned, what's left? The fear isn't just that atheists are wrong, it's that they might not need what religion provides. And if they don't need it, maybe no one does? This isn't just theory. It plays out in how societies treat non-believers. In some countries, atheists are denied legal rights. In others, they're vilified in media or kept out of public office, not because they've done harm, but because their existence raises questions people aren't ready to answer. And while those reactions might look extreme, they come from the same core impulse, the fear that disbelief is contagious. Because it is. Not in a sinister way, not through force or manipulation, but through example. One person walking away from belief calmly, without anger, without scandal, invites others to ask why. And once that question is asked honestly, religion has a hard time maintaining control. That's the real fear, not that atheism is militant, but that it's reasonable, that it can't be dismissed as rebellion or trauma or sin, that it can look like curiosity, like honesty, like someone finally admitting that they don't know and that maybe no one does. Religions have survived for so long not because they were never questioned, but because the questions were contained. Atheism doesn't play that game. It asks what happens if you take the questions seriously and follow them all the way down, not to a new dogma, not to a new ritual, but to a place where meaning is not inherited, but made. That's not chaos, that's freedom. And freedom has always been more threatening than belief. Freedom comes with a cost. It doesn't offer the comfort of certainty or the illusion of control. But it does offer something else. The chance to build a life grounded in what's real, not what's revealed. And that's the core divide. Religion says, accept first, question later, or not at all. Atheism says, question first, accept only if the answer holds up. It's not about rejecting all meaning. It's about being honest about where that meaning comes from, not from gods, not from books, but from human beings, flawed, searching, alive. And that kind of honesty can be unsettling. It asks us to take responsibility not just for our actions, but for the values behind them. There's no divine fallback, no supernatural moral authority. Just us? But just us isn't nothing. In fact, it might be everything. It means the things we care about. Justice, love, compassion, truth matter because we make them matter. Not because they were handed to us, but because we chose them. That's a harder path, but it's also a more authentic one. And that authenticity is exactly what makes atheism quietly powerful. It doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need a pulpit. Its presence alone is enough to make people wonder if they've ever really questioned what they believe, or why. Not just whether their religion is true, but whether they would still believe it if they hadn't been taught to from birth. That's not an accusation, it's a mirror. And mirrors can be uncomfortable, especially when you've been told your whole life that the reflection is already perfect, that the answers are already known, that the truth has already been revealed. But when someone steps away from that, without bitterness, without trauma, simply because they saw through it, it opens a door others didn't know was there. And what's behind that door isn't emptiness, it's possibility. It's a space where questions are allowed to stay open, where doubt isn't a sin, but a sign of thought, where the absence of belief isn't a hole to be filled, but a foundation to build something real. That's the fear. Not that atheism leads to despair, but that it might lead to meaning. Without obedience, purpose, without myth, morality, without reward. That kind of freedom doesn't need to convert anyone, it just needs to exist. Because once people realize they don't need gods to be good, or holy books to be whole, or sacred rituals to feel wonder, the spell starts to break. And when it breaks, the power structures built on it begin to shake. That's why religion fears atheism more than other religions. Because it doesn't offer new beliefs. It offers a way out, not an escape from meaning, but an escape from the illusion that meaning must come from above. It offers a life where we can admit that we don't have all the answers, and live well anyway. Where we don't need to pretend that ancient texts hold eternal truths, or that morality comes from fear, or that suffering has cosmic purpose. Where we can grieve without telling ourselves it's part of a plan. Where we can love without needing divine permission. Where we can be human and know that's enough. Because in the end, atheism doesn't ask for faith, it asks for courage. The courage to live in a world where nothing is guaranteed, where death is final, where truth is always provisional, but where meaning can still be real because we make it so, and that, more than anything, is what religion has always feared most. Not destruction, not blasphemy, not evil, but freedom.